I'm delighted to be here, though, of course, ideally, we wouldn't need to be here, but here we are, trying in our own ways to help keep the United Kingdom a kingdom united. I'm taking the title of my own modest effort today from two lines from Thomas Hardy. If way to the better there be, it exacts a full look at the worst. And the worst for me means the hostile forces now operating against the Union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. After 13 years living in County Down, my wife and I returned to British Columbia, Canada in the autumn of 2021. I've lived in Vancouver since 1974, when I was appointed Assistant Professor of English while living in Dublin from 1972, Assistant Professor of English at the University of British Columbia, and before that in Belfast from 1970, having returned in 1970 from Oregon, where I finished my 5 years of doctoral studies at the University of Oregon. I was born, raised, and educated in Belfast, where I lived until age 23. I flew out in a BOAC Super VC-10 to the end of the historic Oregon Trail, the Willamette Valley, where the town of Eugene sits. I returned to the UK, to Northern Ireland, often carrying, as I do, two well-used passports. Before returning to BC in 2021, a website for returning Canadian expatriates warned us that Canada had changed and so had we. The website was correct. I suspect the changes we found were most evident in the lower mainland and southern Vancouver Island, where we now live, in British Columbia, in the city of Toronto, and by all accounts in the province of Quebec. The changes were to the physical and social worlds, but also to the worlds of opinion and policy that help shape the physical and social worlds. Through high-volume immigration, Toronto had grown by 1 million residents since I taught a term at the University of Toronto in 2005. Surrey, adjoining Vancouver to the southeast, had now become the second largest city in BC, overtaking the capital Victoria, and characterized now by its huge, hard-working Indo-Canadian population. In BC, to the familiar and vaguely self-congratulatory daily journalistic preoccupation with property prices had been added the preoccupation with a housing crisis and homelessness. The other daily preoccupation with vicious armed gangs deepened as they became part of BC culture and have become part of BC culture, the assassination rate easily exceeding Belfast's. One of these gangs rejoices, perhaps ironically, in the name United Nations. Vancouver itself is now a gleaming city of 40, 50, 60-story office blocks and condominiums, monuments to wealth and globalism. It is no longer the rather frail and friendly large town on the edge of the empire that it was when I arrived there in 1974, with old world Greek and Italian quarters and an old nationalistic ramshackle Chinese Chinatown and a major street, Robson Street, then called Robsonstrasse. So population growth, economic growth, and accelerating ethnic and cultural diversification were some of the changes since I left in 2008. But changes of scale, not of nature. The changes had been brewing since the 1980s, since the introduction of the policy of multiculturalism, championed by Trudeau père, and an immigrant investment program leading to early residence and citizenship for wealthy incomers from offshore. But in Quebec, scale had indeed shaded into nature. While the rest of Canada, ROC, had grown more diverse through multiculturalism, Quebec was doubling down on its historic identity and heritage. By 2022, when the Quebec government passed Bill 96, an amendment to the Charter of the French language, promoting the use of the French language in the province, it was also referring to itself as the Quebec Nation, without, as far as I know, any federal objection. And a nation within a nation, Quebec now is, in effect, as the late Rex Murphy pointed out. and with some plausibility, since the province has its own immigration policy, language policy, and trade rules, among its other enviable powers. A friend who teaches in the province tells me that one of the features of Quebec nationalism, its informal policy of de-Anglicization, proceeds apace. Despite the decline in the power of the Catholic Church from the 1960s, before which Catholicism was a chief contributor to provincial identity, despite the loss of two sovereignty referenda in 1980 and 1995, Quebec nationalism has rolled on. It has been curbed as a sovereigntist movement, as Trudeau the Younger would no doubt claim, and Trudeau the Elder intended, but only because another sovereignty referendum might not be needed to satisfy Quebec nationalists, though recently the desire for definitive independence has again been noised abroad in the province. I don't think it would be insulting to say that Quebec nationalism is a political force pampered by a liberal federal government that ought to be its enemy. Another pampered nationalism is Irish nationalism, which at first shared with Quebec nationalism a Catholic foundation in a larger Protestant country. It too, if anything, has prospered and become emboldened in its secular form after the decline of the Irish Catholic Church from the 1990s, despite the fact that Catholicism was for long regarded as one of the essential pillars of Irish national identity, alongside the Irish language and a republican form of self-government outside the ambit of England. Similarly, a central government, conservative or Labour, which one would have assumed would see its threat, certainly in Northern Ireland, to the existing federation or union, has seemed in the eyes of Northern Irish unionists to encourage Irish nationalism, and at the worrying expense of those same unionists. How to explain the survival of Quebec nationalism? In the eyes of other Canadians, it is not the charismatic movement or force it very briefly was in the 1970s, when actually it was associated with violence. Indeed, recent Canadian immigrants from such quarters of the globe as India, Hong Kong, mainland China, and the Philippines would hardly care about the historic tension between the two founding nations or the possibility of Quebec's secession. A growing indifference in the rest of Canada, ROC, to what had once been a national crisis has perhaps contributed to the quiet success of Quebec identitarianism. And would I be cynical or wrong to suggest that Trudeau the Elder, troubled by the simmering hostility between the two solitudes, as it was called, thought multiculturalism the answer, diversify one of the solitudes to make many solitudes, though he didn't say that, and the hostility is dampened. The power of Quebec nationalism became a soft but more effective power. If Trudeau succeeded, it was at the expense of the identity of that vast entity called ROC, no longer just Anglophone, but multilingual as well as multicultural. But how to explain the much greater attraction of Irish nationalism to British governments, and even, it seems, to much of the populace of the mainland UK, or at least to explain the failure to confront its threat to the Union, even in periods of striking Anglophobia, for example, during the protracted Brexit negotiations. Just read the Irish Times of that period, or Fintan O'Toole's broadside, Heroic Failure, Brexit and the Politics of Pain, to get the picture in Ireland. The UK seemed to take no serious umbrage. In 1945, George Orwell, reviewing a Sean O'Casey autobiography, explained the English failure to condemn the Anglophobia of Irish nationalism as England's colonial guilt. Why is it, he asked, that the worst extremes of jingoism and racialism have to be tolerated when they come from an Irishman? Quote, England's bad conscience, was his answer. Quote, it is difficult to object to Irish nationalism without seeming to condone centuries of English tyranny and exploitation. No doubt that plays a role, and if so, Irish America was, during the Troubles and in its customary time lag, a menacing oblique reminder? And if so, Ulster Unionism is its collateral damage. An English friend and university colleague in Vancouver once gave me another explanation. Jack, he said, England only respects those who stand up to it. She respects the Americans, but not the Canadians. The Australians, but not the New Zealanders. The Indians, but not, and I forget his alternative in this case, Irish Republicans, but not Ulster Loyalists. Now that may be fanciful, but whatever the reason, the negative image of Northern Irish Unionists has driven me to mild despair. When did I last read a heartfelt defence and promotion of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom from Great Britain? All seems begrudgery and tokenism when it isn't distaste and a genuine desire for unionism to accept its fateful succumbing to Irish unification, and without debate or discussion, since unification is thought to be inevitable. It may be that on a larger and world significant scale, Israel is about to occupy a comparably unenviable, unpitied status. Northern Ireland is something of a constitutional orphan and a grumbling appendix in the UK body politic. Now, how can we improve the image of Northern Irish Unionists in Great Britain, and by so doing, generate serious support for Northern Irish Unionism, and indirectly, one hopes, for the whole Union? Well, one way is for Unionist politicians to reimagine themselves and then conduct themselves as Unionists, promoters and stewards of the whole Union. As long as I remember, Unionist politicians have seemed minor provincial figures with a shrunken revolutionary worldview. By the time I'd become politically half aware, the aristocratic and gentry Unionists had withdrawn. For example, Lord Londonderry, along with his ahead-of-the-curve wish for integrated education. Figures such as Lord Perry, of British and international stature. From the early 1970s, the IRA terrorists drove Unionist business people underground and out of politics. That was surely the terrorist plan, all pseudo-Marxist nonsense in the 1973 Sinn Féin manifesto to the contrary. And when the dust settled on the back streets and the town centres, the lower middle class and the working class, those who'd been closer to the ferocity and violence to be feared, were largely in charge. Many of them brave, but many of them unqualified to govern above small town council level. I myself derive from that stratum of Northern Irish, sceptical, cynical, reluctant to cooperate or share, pessimistic. Not a lovable population, and unblessed on the whole by warm personalities, though I say it myself. Today, the pro-union parties can't bring themselves to unite or even cooperate. A thrawn people, as we used to say in our Ulster Scots, and often our own worst enemies. Whether or not a huge, expensive public relations exercise, which I've contemplated without the necessary wallet, could rescue the image of Northern Irish Unionism, I don't know. But such an exercise oughtn't to be necessary. It might do wonders if the English, Scots and Welsh saw Ulster Unionists pitching in to British issues and concerns and eloquently championing the ties that bind us all, as the Scots Neil Oliver has done in his remarkable short pro-union manifesto. In my own small act of practical symbolism, I voted for Brexit because I voted as a citizen of the kingdom. To leave the EU was, I decided, in the best interests of my country. To vote leave was to vote to remand the UK in the custody of a vast bureaucracy. Had I voted in devolved garb as a resident of Northern Ireland, I might have voted Remain, as I know some Unionists did. So the protocol and Windsor framework in the context of my motivation for voting the way I did have been bitter pills for a UK Brexiteer to swallow. I wonder if a series of symposia like this one, but bilateral, between the nations and regions of the Union would help. A series of cultural tete-a-tete as it were. That would be 6 bilateral symposia in the first series, if my arithmetic is right. They could investigate and promote the historic and current cultural rather than political intimacies between the nations and provinces at the more intimate level of the bilateral. Although politicians could be invited as auditors and secondary participants, they would be there chiefly to learn from the cultural historians, writers and artists. Though one of the peculiarities of Northern Ireland is it's very difficult to find artists and writers who are pro-union. The series could be called Ties That Bind, after my friend and colleague Graham Walker's recent book, co-written with James Greer, Ties That Bind Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Union. Worth a try, perhaps. After all, it is, I think, in the Northern Ireland case, the apparent and erroneous cultural foreignness of Ulster Unionism and the Northern Irish generally that repels many in Britain, chiefly because the media, the politicians and the commentariat lazily equate historic loyalist display culture, parades, bonfires, sashes, flags and banners, with culture in Northern Ireland. But culture in Northern Ireland is chiefly the shared culture of the UK. One lesson might be learned from such symposia: the central impact of English culture in its widest sense on the whole archipelago. The wealth and health of England and English culture and history are the mainstay of our union. But we must be realistic. Between Ulster Unionists and the rest of the UK, ROUK, stands the sleepless Irish nationalists. I don't think turning Ulster Unionists into less unattractive figures is enough, or even possible, without confronting and facing down Irish nationalism, the enemy not just of Northern Unionists, but also of British Unionism. Irish nationalist activists see their enterprise as a zero-sum game, which is why they are entirely uninterested in what makes Unionists tick, and why their idea of a debate about Ulster Irish unity is a one-way discussion of the nuts and bolts of a consummating inevitability. No Republic of Ireland political party or high-profile political figure, in my experience, questions the national necessity of an impending united Ireland, or the fracturing of the UK, in other words. Speaking of nuts and bolts, the Trinity College economist John Fitzgerald recently annoyed unificationists by estimating the financial cost of the Republic of unifying North and South at €20 billion. Now he has backtracked by looking again at his sums. He has now told the Southern Joint Committee on the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, an agreement which is now widely seen by nationalists, I think, as the imprimatur for unification, that if Northern Ireland was to reform its education system to make it more democratic, it would reduce the cost of unification. That's okay then, John. We'll do that for you. Anything to help in our own extinction. Unilateral, detailed discussion at the Fitzgerald and Brendan O'Leary level is a way of gaslighting unionists. It has had some success. When a unionist minister says she doesn't contemplate a united Ireland in her lifetime, she has been gaslit. To offer one's own lifetime at the age of 44 as the possible life expectancy of the Union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland seems to me to accept the inevitability of the breakup of that union. The problem, as I see it, is this, and it is independent of Northern Ireland, though Northern Ireland is damaged by it. Irish nationalism exerts a power on Britain seemingly beyond policy or politics, in the realm of image, imagination, even unacknowledged desire. Perhaps one could trace its strange allure to the romanticism of mid and late 19th century English and Anglo-Irish novelists, followed by the decided attraction of that literary and cultural revival spearheaded by Yeats, Synge and others between the 1890s and 1920s. A literary revival, by the way, that ignored all Irish literature that depicted Irish-English intimacies. And there was a great deal of it, as I discovered when I researched my Oxford University Press book, Irish Novels 1890 to 1940. The allure seems not to have really subsided or been tested beside reality. Indeed, as we Northern Irish Unionists know to our cost, reality has so far been no match for Irish nationalism. British politicians seem to believe, or affect to believe, or lead us to assume they believe, that there is something unreal, childlike, or immaterial about Irish nationalism, despite those years of Republican outrages on mainland soil and the deaths of British soldiers. Some odd cognitive and cultural dissonance is at work. Some peculiar combination of misguided liberalism and somnambulation, perhaps even the power of what resides darkly in the attic. How to demystify and decharismatize, if I can invent a word, how to demystify and decharismatize Irish nationalism is the challenge. Orwell did it effortlessly. In 1940, he noted approvingly a German journalist's reference to ERA as, quote, a sham independent country. Its persistent spell of nationalism, Irish nationalism, allowed a Times journalist, for example, in a column last week, to write a long, jokey, admiring profile of the Irish language rappers Kneecap, whose name is derived from the notorious IRA punishment, to which the columnist even makes a jokey reference, without reminding his readers what happens when paramilitary vigilantes put a bullet in their often underage abductees' kneecaps and sometimes their ankles as well to complete a four-pack. Kneecap has painted a very public mural in West Belfast demanding England get out of Ireland. But it's just good fun, even though all the Republic's political parties are indirectly saying the same thing and meaning it. And make no mistake, we Unionists are also England in this regard. Their second mural depicts a police Land Rover on fire with RUC not welcome daubed underneath. Kneecap will be shortly performing at Glastonbury, Leeds and Reading, and the English fans will lap them up. One Northern Irish columnist has written, quote, there'd be less romanticism around Kneecap if they were loyalists. Indeed, the columnist was Maria Cahill, the Catholic woman who alleged she was raped as a teenager by a senior IRA member. From 2016, the Republic gave Britain a very hard time over Brexit. The Republic was the EU's cat's paw, but the EU was also the Republic's cat's paw. The two were playing different if parallel games. The EU was concerned to punish the UK. The Republic was at first, I believe, in panic mode over the possible impact of Brexit on the South, but then realised Brexit could be a leap towards a united Ireland and thus a blow against the UK. Despite this, in 2019, Simon Coveney, the UK's chief bugbear during Brexit, and his UK counterpart, reaffirmed the common travel area by which, among other things, hundreds of thousands of Southern Irish happily live, work and vote in the UK. And I'm quite sure that the Republic envisages, in the event of United Ireland, in other words, wresting Northern Ireland from the UK, the common travel area continuing. Irish citizens gaily enjoying unfettered access to the UK, while Unionists are deprived of their British citizenship, though they might, I suppose, enjoy some British overseas citizenship status. I wonder if mainland politicians assume, even without thinking, that Irish nationalism is no threat to them. The Protocol, for example, and its alias, the Windsor Framework. Yet Orwell reminded us in 1945 that nationalism is inseparable from the desire for power, that it thinks in terms of competitive prestige. If so, Ireland's gain will be the UK's loss. When the framework was announced, Tom McTague in Unheard, Mick Hume in Spiked, and Brendan O'Neill in spite, all clever people, all said it had negative ramifications for the whole UK. Fraser Myers, in spite, claimed that the protocol, quote, will do nothing to fulfil the Brexit promise of restoring the UK's sovereignty, end quote. But all have been ignored, the prevailing assumption being that what happens to Northern Ireland doesn't truly affect the rest of ROUK. And alas, those mainland opponents seem to have fallen silent, Ulster Unionists once more alone. Yet I find myself thinking melodramatically, I agree, of Kipling's lines in his 1912 poem Ulster, written at the time Unionists feared they were being delivered into the hands of the Catholic Church and Irish republicanism, and time proved them utterly justified. By the way, though no one, at least of all the Southern Irish, have acknowledged they were absolutely correct. Instead, all we hear is about the iniquity of partition, a political solution at the time which saved my grandparents' bacon and the bacon of all Protestants, agnostics and atheists in the north of the island. But Kipling's lines, these: if England drive us forth, we shall not fall alone. Dorothy Sayers wrote a patriotically defiant poem in 1940 when things looked grim, and she called it The English War. It contains the premise line, the single island like a tower ringed with an angry host, ignoring, for reasons of a Shakespearean flourish and the drama of a nation at bay, the fact that we in Northern Ireland were also fighting Hitler from our industrial arsenal, and likewise the Scots. I can't help thinking that in the event of Irish republicanism succeeding in wresting Northern Ireland from the UK and achieving the final border down the Irish Sea, the single remaining island might suddenly seem a little shrunken, and with an emboldened republic to its west, with its entirely different geopolitical view of the republic of the world as the strenuously anti-Israel, pro-Palestine foreign policy of the republic is now exemplifying. In 1945, Orwell wrote, "Era can only remain independent because of British protection." Recent commentators have said the same thing, and the February 2024 Policy Exchange report by Hendricks and Hallam, to which some speakers have adverted, closing the back door, Northern Ireland's role in British national security, analyses the Republic of Ireland's security negligence and costly dependence, costly to the British taxpayer that is, on the UK and NATO for its defence, a kind of homology to the happy success of Southern Irish talent in Britain, while home politicians equally happily design ways of reducing the UK to Sayers' single island. For its whole existence since 1922, but particularly since the IRA campaign began in 1969, followed by the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, and further declarations and frameworks leading to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, followed by Brexit and the Protocol, Northern Ireland has been on the business end of a hostile Irish joint policy of decolonisation and indigenisation. That is, if we reduce decolonisation to what is now called British settler colonialism, and indigenisation to what is regarded, or rather imagined by nationalists, as the natural and original state of Irish sovereignty, which included a ubiquitous fluency in the Irish language, which the recent Irish Language Act, Northern Ireland, is attempting to simulate. Northern nationalists have belatedly revived and are now obeying the imperative in Douglas Hyde's 1892 manifesto, the necessity of de-Anglicising Ireland, which led to the Gaelic League, the Gaelic Revival, and the whole potent dimension of Irish separatism. The Northern Irish poet Seamus Heaney once remarked that it seems like the whole world is becoming Ulsterized. When I returned to Canada, I thought I saw mutatis mutandis what he meant. The Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission published its findings in 2015 and proposed 94 calls to action. They can be broadly brought under the headings of decolonization and indigenization, and they are now the Canadian national project, even creed, and which has succeeded multiculturalism. A year later, Justin Trudeau told the New York Times that Canada is a brand new kind of country with no history in the ordinary sense, its colonial history to be erased, but rather, quote, a pan-cultural heritage. There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada. So the real danger to ROC, or rather this thing called Canada, as the woke now say with smug scare quotes, is less the Quebec nationalism, which Trudeau leaves untrammeled, than the new zeitgeist being contrived in the rest of Canada. Decolonization, which essentially means the removal of salient traces of British discovery, settlement and development, is now implemented with vigour by government departments, museums, galleries, schools and universities, particularly in British Columbia and Ontario. Likewise, its partner indigenization, which means much more than affirmative action in hiring. White educators mean by indigenization nativizing the whole curriculum, not just creating indigenous syllabuses. It is less about inclusion than replacement. It means nativizing pedagogy, educational missions, values and goals, redefining education and our very idea of a university, even of knowledge itself, by which science is reduced to Western science, since indigenous knowledges, all is plural in universities today, is equal to, indeed often superior to, Western knowledge, Western culture, Western civilization. Anyone who seriously objects, as the Indigenous Studies expert Professor Frances Widdowson did, is fired, as she was from Mount Royal University and is now legally fighting back. Decolonization and indigenization are having very real consequences, among them censoring and cancellation. Belfry Theatre in BC's capital Victoria recently cancelled performances of The Runner, a hitherto acclaimed and intense Canadian play by Christopher Morris about an Israeli first responder who tends to a wounded Arab girl instead of attending to the body of an Israeli soldier she's suspected of having killed. The play is about the protagonist's attempt to salvage humanity amidst warring tribal forces. But any such virtue was rejected by pro-Palestinian activists who refused to countenance any play from a, quote, settler colonialist perspective, and that contained an iota of sympathy for an Israeli character, and who daubed the theatre with graffiti and in a petition demanded cancellation, to which the theatres in Victoria and Vancouver complied. This is at the behest of decolonization. Another award-winning play, Sisters, is by a Canadian playwright who ironically has devoted her entire dramatic career to staging every woke theme going, sympathetically. Sisters focuses on the journey of a young nun in an Indian residential school, from innocent surprise to complicity in the racist treatment of First Nations. Not enough, alas. The playwright is white and should not even be writing such a play. It was promptly cancelled in Vancouver at the behest of indigenization. The rejection of an overall, primarily British cultural identity that gave the old Canadian mosaic and early multiculturalism their coherence has encouraged what are emerging as diasporic nationalisms. They need not be nationalisms per se, though in the case of clashing Sikh nationalism and Hindu nationalism in Ontario recently, the so-called Diwali riots, they are. They can be what in her book, Political Tribes, Group Instinct and the Fate of Nations, Amy Chua calls tribalisms in the US, which qualify as nationalisms in Orwell's Notes on Nationalism, 1945. In any case, indigenization, whose proponents no longer wish to recognize the legitimacy of Canada and tribalism seem to me a threat to the identity of Canada and thus to the Commonwealth. Similar radical patterns, as you know, are emerging in Australia and New Zealand, and with different inflections in the United States and the United Kingdom, in the English-speaking world, in other words. So the threat to the Union, the United Kingdom, of the nationalisms of the constituent nations and provinces, Welsh, Scottish and Irish in Northern Ireland, to that threat can be added not only Irish republicanism based in the Republic, but also the possible threat of imported diasporic nationalisms from far-flung regions of the world. But what of the Republic of Ireland as the other English-speaking countries face troubling times? Irish diasporic nationalism in the UK is a curious phenomenon if it really exists at all. It could be argued that Irish nationalists in Northern Ireland are not diasporic nationalists inside the UK, except on a constitutional technicality, but are instead in their own homeland. That nut is for another day to crack. The thousands of Southern Irish in Great Britain are regarded by the Irish back home as a diaspora. Many of the recipients of the Irish Presidential Distinguished Service Awards are to those living, working, thriving, voting and serving society in Great Britain, but not, I assume, over the border in Northern Ireland. But they don't conduct themselves as a diaspora. I've done some casual research into the innumerable, highly successful and high-profile Southern Irish in Great Britain, many of them in the public eye and many of them tremendously talented. What is apparent is the contentment of most of these figures living British lives. No blacks, Irish or dogs is a legendary imperative belonging to some distant past and perhaps fiction. What is also apparent is their deafening silence on the success of their lives in Britain, that for almost all would have been impossible back in Ireland. They don't break silence because they aren't brave enough to question the contemporary relevance of the story of Ireland, a story of victimhood at the hands of perfidious England, to which all politicians seem to cleave, and which prevents that reconciliation between Ireland and England that I believe is a prerequisite to peace and reconciliation on the island. The current President of the Republic is one of the chief purveyors of that story of limitless grievance, which is way beyond its tell-by date. The positive experience of the Irish in England, if declared, could make nonsense of those explicit and implicit claims to victimhood, still used to justify the campaign for United Ireland, and the Irish schadenfreude enjoyed when England's difficulty is once again Ireland's opportunity to echo Daniel O'Connell and John Mitchell, as during the late Brexit negotiations. If only those talented Irish in Britain could be recruited to sing the praises of England's endless opportunities for the Irish, to declare the intimacy of Britain and Ireland as something devoutly to be wished, as Liam Halligan, the Telegraph's economist and English son of Irish parents, has done, something that would severely reduce what is perceived by Irish Republicans as the necessity of breaking up the Union by its campaign to wrench Northern Ireland from the UK. But the Irish in Britain have so far declined to counter the Anglophobia back home. I've cudgeled my brains thinking where and how this liberating breakthrough could be begun. Certainly the Republican orthodoxy, which would have to be broken through, is one maintained by a government, a set of political parties, and a commentariat in almost unanimous agreement. The result is the existence of two contradictory Irelands on the archipelago, only one of which wields power. One lives happily inside Britain, the other keeps the old enmity alive. Indeed, I've come to believe that for many Irish nationalists, Northern Ireland is a proxy issue, that Irish nationalism's issue at base is with England, a case of unfinished business that can't be put head to because it can't be acknowledged. Northern Ireland, in whom most Southern Irish are uninterested and know little about, can seem to me suspiciously like a pretext. The jury, however, is out whether Irish nationalism's threat to the Union can survive two current international unfoldings: mass immigration and Gaza. The Republic of Ireland appeared until recently to be immune from a threat to social cohesion caused by high volume immigration and the official welcome to a torrent of asylum seekers from unfamiliar countries of the world. It seemed to be odd man out among the English-speaking nations. So it came as a surprise to many of us, certainly to me, that these have had a destabilizing impact on working class Dublin and rural towns and villages that mirrors that impact in the UK, but is more localised and eruptive in the Republic. Now, both parts of Ireland have a long history of rioting and arson. The November 2023 riots and looting in central Dublin, propelled by working class north side anti-immigrant anger, inflamed by an acute housing crisis, had echoes of the third act of Sean O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars, set during the Easter 1916 rebellion. Then has come the burning down of hotels and halls earmarked for asylum seekers, with its odd echoes of the burning down of the Anglo-Irish big houses. But this time, the arson is by Miles McGopoline's plain people of Ireland, not Sinn Féin, against whom the plain people have turned on the matter of immigration. Suddenly, the people have voiced their disapproval of multiculturalism. Mind you, the plain people are reacting as nationalists, outflanking the political parties and even Sinn Féin, whom they regard as nationalist traitors. Ireland is full. No more plantation on the protesters' placards are nationalist catch cries. With Ireland newly receiving the disruptive imprint of what is happening in the big world, I was sure that the Republic would have its hands too full to worry about a united Ireland. After all, the United Ireland campaign is premised on a firmly cohesive Irish nation, so cohesive it can apparently absorb almost 1 million unionists loyal to the UK and keep its cohesion with just some shuffling of feet to accommodate the angry new citizens. Moreover, those plain people are probably pretty anti-unionist and also tired of top-down government. But then, simultaneously, events in Israel on October 7th, 2023, and the ensuing Israeli response occurred, providing something of a distraction, one perhaps welcomed by the mainstream politicians. The government and political parties losing ground, and some faced during the anti-immigration uproar, have taken unanimous charge again with what Jake Wallace-Simons calls Dublin's vindictive hostility to Jerusalem. This and the alleged anti-Semitism in Irish society both drive a wedge between nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland. Unionists are chiefly pro-Israel, and more importantly, between the foreign policies of the UK and the Republic. Commentators seem agreed that the claim to victimhood is what draws Irish nationalists to the Palestinian cause, though there's more to it than that. But whatever the cause, it has deep cultural roots that are not shared in Great Britain or Unionist Northern Ireland. Since the memory of victimhood is a rationale for the United Ireland campaign, it perhaps oughtn't to be a surprise that the campaign is carrying on amidst popular anti-immigration unrest and party political and government activism on behalf of Palestinian statehood. They are twin fixations on the part of those who govern the Republic. On Saturday, June 15th, there was a provocative Ireland's Future rally in the SSE Arena in Belfast, premised on the certainty, quote, "A border poll on Irish unity is closer now than ever." Leo Varadkar, out of office and apparently reinventing himself as the unification statesman, spoke at the rally. A united Ireland must now become a political objective for all the Southern Irish political parties and the people, he said, no longer just an aspiration. I think he must envision himself an historic role for himself in bringing to fulfillment what one Ireland's future activist standing at the border called the 1916 Project. That project augured ill for the UK in 1916 and does so today. Together UK will have to eliminate all daylight between Together and UK to defeat this project. What I fear is that the various fronts of the United Ireland campaign including the economic fallout and expansion from the sea border, the official spread of the Irish language for purely political and territorial purposes, and the Republic's own built-in road initiative in Northern Ireland's infrastructure, will mean that virtual nationhood will come to the island over unionist objections and to the detriment of the integrity of the UK, as stealthily as it has come to the province of Quebec, unless we stay awake to all the threats to the United Kingdom we love. Thank you very much.